there's no real like true out winner from, a big trade war like this. Who ends up ultimately paying it is, you, I, and a lot of our American neighbors when they're going to go buy a new vehicle over the next kind of year if this is the world we end up in.
Welcome to The Fuel Line, where we explore all things automotive with a focus on mergers and acquisitions. Hi, my name's Fareed Ahmed. I'm the founder and the CEO of DSMA and your favorite podcast host. Each episode, we connect with influential figures that drive the automotive landscape. Let's shift into gear and get started. We're excited to have back Erik Johnson, the senior economist from BMO. Erik has an impressive background, including expertise in emerging risks, market, and macroeconomic trends focused on the automotive industry. He also has impressive degrees from Berkeley University and Queen's University. Hey, Erik, great to have you back. Thank you very much. Erik, today we really want to talk about what's on the forefront of most dealers and manufacturers' minds, the tariffs. And there's nobody we believe that has more expertise in this area than you, and we really thank you. Now, before we set this up, we did ask a few people some questions, our audience, and if you don't mind, I'll just go through a few of the questions they asked. So the first question that a dealer asked me was, how do you think tariffs will affect Canada, and do you believe Trump will expand those tariffs and impose more?
Well, Fareed, first of all, it's great to be back. Always a pleasure to chat with you. And I think, much like everyone else, I'm also sort of in this world of trying to figure out exactly what's going to be going on and how that's going to shake out both for the Canadian economy, the global economy, and certainly the auto sector as well. And so I think when we're focused in on Canada specifically, what, our listeners should understand is that the Canadian economy is very oriented towards trade with the United States. Roughly 20% of our GDP is sent south of the border every year. And so, any kind of disruption to that exchange of goods and services, can have a meaningful impact on, what's going to be the future of our kind of economic path going forward. Sure. And so that's why there was a lot of certainly, anxiety, a lot of concern, a little over a week ago when, we thought for moments there for, 72 hours or so that we were going to get hit sort of across the board with 25% tariffs. Ultimately, we were able to kind of carve a deal to delay the implementation of those for 30 days, not really changing very much from what we'd offered in December around border security, other than kind of creating a notional position around, kind of fentanyl border control or our fentanyl czar, so to speak. But I think, what we are seeing is the, new kind of administration in the US is very set on the idea of protecting their domestic economy, in particular manufacturing. And we've seen continued themes of that this week, whether it's, the newly announced steel and aluminum tariffs, they're back. And then we've also heard discussion in the last, few days about the idea of reciprocal tariffs. And certainly there was an interview on Fox News recently where Trump was also again talking about, an auto industry tariff on Canada in particular. And so again, I think these are all things that would be very concerning to the Canadian economy, particularly in sectors like automotive, but, energy would be another big one. About a third of our exports to the United States are in the energy product category. A lot of that is, oil from Alberta heading to the Midwest, and also hydro, all these kind of things. Right. And so for the auto sector specifically, and why, I think you heard a lot of executives in the last kind of week and a half raise a lot of concerns about that, is it's a very integrated supply chain. So if I'm, building a spark plug and it's going into a crankshaft, say in Mexico, often then that might get shipped to another kind of parts facility in Manitoba, let's say, where, a few other components get added onto it. And then it's, shipped down to another assembly yard in Ohio, where maybe, the rest of the vehicle is put together, but, they don't put the finishing touches on it. Maybe they then ship that across the border again to a facility in, Ontario, where the final trims and paint job are kind of done there. And so the challenge with something like a big tariff, say it's 25 25%, or I think the other concerning thing we learned that if the broad tariffs come back on March 4th, the steel and aluminum tariffs would be additive onto those. So we're talking about, potentially a 50% tariff on some of those items. Is if things are crossing the border over and over and over again, that quickly can scale up the cost of producing a vehicle in the North American area that becomes very prohibitive.
But who pays for that cost?
And this is exactly it, right? I think the challenge is we all pay for that cost, right? So I think what we've learned in the last few years is, there's a lot more resistance and anxiety on the part of consumers of, going out and having to make these everyday bigger kind of purchases, specifically, whether that's a new or a used automobile, and, getting a little bit of sticker shock, right? If I bought a vehicle in 2017 and all of a sudden, I'm buying one in this environment, they have very different kind of underlying costs from the consumer's point of view. And then, what this would do is, certainly scale those up potentially in an intractable way, right?
Yeah.
If you think of, the margins on most kind of tier 2 and tier 3 auto parts suppliers, they're in the, medium to high single digit range.
Right.
And so whether we're talking about 10%, whether we're talking about 25%, very quickly you arrive at a number that's going to be very hard for the industry to kind of continue to exist in its, current very efficient and mutually beneficial, dynamics between Canada, the US, and Mexico. And so I think that's really where we're seeing the concern. And so if we think back to what happened a few years ago when we had, COVID shutdowns, when we had chip shortages, it had a meaningful impact on new vehicle supply. And certainly if we do end up in a version of the future and, Trump does seem quite keen on putting in tariffs, we could see some potential disruptions to, vehicle supply again. And that certainly would pass on through to prices both here. We import a lot of vehicles from the United States, but it would also, pass on to the cost of a new vehicle and a used vehicle, certainly for American customers as well.
COVID was a little bit different because it was a global pandemic.
Yeah.
This tariff, with the increase in cost, and let's face it, GM produce here, Ford produce here, Toyota, Honda, isn't the U.S. consumer also going to get affected by these price increases?
Oh, absolutely. I think, if we're talking about, steel specifically, it is true that, Ford, yesterday in some comments at an investor meeting mentioned that, domestically, at least in the part of production they control, they're using roughly, 90% U.S. steel in their kind of production chain. But a lot of their part suppliers might be importing steel or aluminum from Canada or other places. And so that's why there's no real true out-winner from, a big trade war like this. Who ends up ultimately paying it is, you, I, and, a lot of our American neighbors when they're going to go buy a new vehicle over the next kind of year if this is the world we end up in.
But isn't that going to create more inflation in the United States?
Absolutely. And if there's one thing that we learned, what do people hate a lot? They hate inflation.
Yes.
And so I think the political economy lesson there would be if you really want to sort of ingratiate yourselves, with the voting base, then, trying to bring inflation down to a stable and low level should be kind of goal number one. And so this is certainly working against that.
Right. Okay. So another dealer, what impact do you think this will have on the automotive industry in Canada? And I don't know if he means the retail automotive industry or he means the dealer automotive industry.
Yeah. So I think there's two different avenues you want to think. So if we do end up with something where we have, pretty significant broad tariffs on, Canadian exports to the United States, at some point going to become a deal breaker for new vehicle production. We heard, Linamar's, kind of chair mentioning that probably within a few weeks you'd see shutdowns.
Sure.
We heard that from other people as well. Obviously, Jim Farley of Ford also mentioned, how disruptive that would be in some comments this week as well. And so I think all those things are pointing to the idea that we would end up in a world for dealers where, the costs of them acquiring, kind of their next round of vehicles on their lots is going to cost them more. And so what is that ultimately going to mean? It's going to mean those prices are going to get passed on to consumers. And we are seeing, consumers are a lot more sensitive on price this year. It's one of the reasons why, the top selling kind of brands tend to be in that subcompact and compact SUV space.
Yes.
And so it is going to have a more meaningful effect on, how many customers are going to come through the door and, what they're going to be willing to kind of spend on trims, all those sorts of things. And then it's also going to potentially push people into the used space. And I think if I'm a dealer who has a lot of my business on used vehicles, the one concern there could be, this other kind of knock-on effect of having tariffs is it might make it, no longer competitive for Canada to export vehicles in a wholesale manner to the United States. And, it is really hard to get an exact idea of the numbers, but certainly, in the height of the pandemic, we heard numbers thrown out there like something like 300,000 used vehicles being shipped from Canada to the United States. And you want to think in the context of the Canadian used vehicle market, we sell roughly around, 3 million vehicles, used vehicles a year. So that's a big number. And if all of a sudden those used vehicles are diverted back into domestic supply, that could have a meaningful impact on price. And so that's where you can kind of potentially see two different channels that a dealer should be kind of concerned about. One is what might happen with used vehicles if we do kind of end up in this tariff world. And the other would be, it might be that much harder to kind of source new vehicles, or certainly source new vehicles at a price that's going to be kind of competitive for a consumer.
Very interesting. Okay, so let's get back to more of the M&A world, which is what Fuel Line was set up for. If you had to look in your crystal ball, do you feel the impact on valuations will be a positive or a negative?
Here's where it gets a little bit murky, right? If we're really kind of zeroed in on applying tariffs to the Canadian and Mexico kind of supply chain here, a little bit ironic as it means if I'm building vehicles in Korea or China or other parts of the world, if I'm only having to face the tariff once upon entry to the United States, it might actually be more cost competitive for those brands to, kind of take over North American vehicle supply a little bit more, which, I think would be a great irony of what, this kind of policy was meant to do, which would be to protect U.S. manufacturing, but it would actually make a lot of those producers, cost uncompetitive with a lot of import kind of brands in that world. And so that is certainly something you could see playing off into the M&A space, right? If I'm, if I have a big portfolio of Ford, GM, or Stellantis dealerships, I'm going to be much more affected by this than, if I'm holding a lot of Kia or Hyundai or, other international brands where maybe rather than selling vehicles that are made in North America and subject to these tariffs, if I'm just going to kind of broadly import all my vehicles to dealers' lots instead.
Wouldn't that be ironic?
Yeah. And so I think that would be a little bit of the thing you could see play out in the M&A space.
So, thank you very much for that. So interest rates, both countries were working very hard over the last 3 or 4 years to bring down the interest rate. Just recently saw another 0.25% cut. With this, I'm assuming with the potential impact on inflation, we could potentially see the increase of rates.
Yeah, so I think it's going to depend a little bit whether we're talking about the U.S. perspective on this or the Canadian perspective. I think the challenge for Canada is, we're so reliant on international trade in our economy that you're going to have a lot of downward pressure on kind of economic activity and output in this country. And that's actually going to put a lot of downward pressure on inflation if we ended up in a world with kind of very broad and, certainly high magnitude tariffs on the Canadian economy. So in that world, probably the Bank of Canada, faces a little bit of this dilemma. Yes, maybe we'll see inflation kind of go up a little bit from where it is today, kind of close to target, but probably the downward effects on the economy would mean that the bank might lean a little bit heavier into kind of monetary easing. In our view, we released, kind of a flash update when we did think that we were going to get these 25% tariffs a little over a week ago. And we said probably rather than maybe the 50 additional basis points of cuts we have in our forecast right now for the Bank of Canada, so that would bring the overnight rate down to 2.5%. In sort of a big trade war, you might see the bank cut by 100 basis points more than that. So instead, you might see them go down to 1.5% to kind of cushion the blow a little bit from that kind of impact. Now, I think on the US, it's a little bit more complicated than what would be the case for the Bank of Canada. So they're currently struggling a little bit with more stubborn inflation than most other countries. CPI just recently came out for January and is a little bit on the high side. Again, we saw that happen last year. I think with the idea that a lot of producers will reset their prices at the beginning of the year, and those typical seasonal patterns that we're used to seeing, say, pre-COVID, have just been fundamentally different since 2022. So it exaggerates a lot of that impulse that we see at the start of the year. So again, it came in hot. It suggests the Fed already needs to be a little bit more patient on its, kind of interest rate normalization. And then if you add on, this idea that additional tariffs would further raise kind of prices in the US, that's where you could see maybe the Fed not just having to stay on pause for longer, but if it got, kind of out of hand in terms of what it meant for inflation expectations, you could even see them maybe talking about a hike or so. And so I think that would be the different dynamics. But I think in the Canadian case, you're probably more likely to see more monetary easing in a trade war than less.
So last question, I promise you. If you were to then give dealers today some guidance or some thought on the short term, how they should manage their business, should they start panicking? Should they go, you know what, nothing's happened yet, so why panic? What if you owned a business, if you owned a car dealership today, what advice would you be giving yourself?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely not a time to panic. I think it's a time to think about the various scenarios that could play out and what we would do,
in each scenario, right?
Depending on how the world plays out. I think if we zoom out a little bit and think, where are we today right now, in the dealer kind of industry in Canada, it's shaping up to be a very good year. If we kind of push aside the threat of tariffs here, January, tied for the all-time best January ever with, over 2.1, million units annualized sold. So I think against that backdrop, it's shaping up to be a good volume year. Interest rates are lower than they were a year ago. That incrementally makes, vehicle financing a little bit better than it was, kind of last year. And so I think that's a good underlying story to have in the back of your mind.
Excellent.
That absent, a lot of this kind of tariff tornado talk, so to speak, we're kind of heading into certainly a market that's tilted a little bit more towards consumers than sellers.
Yes.
As we're seeing kind of more incentives, more inventory on lots. But one where, you should be expecting to sell, certainly more vehicles than you sold kind of in the past couple years here. Now, I think the things you want to be a little bit more cognizant of on the risk side would be, do I have a big US exposure in my business? In the sense, am I, having to import a lot of used vehicles from the US or buying from US auctions? Then I might want to have a plan. Am I hedging any of that currency risk? Or if I have, some US dealers already in my portfolio, maybe I can take advantage of that because, if we do see a big movement in the Canadian dollar, having some of my revenue come from the US side, insulates me from a little bit of that. And then the second piece of it is to think really carefully about your used inventory, right? If we do end up in a world where it's a lot harder to kind of make a buck, pushing those used vehicles to the United States, do I have a plan to kind of integrate those into my, network of sales domestically? And so I think those are the risks you want to really be planning for. Sure. And then again, if we do end up in a situation where, it is a lot harder to source new vehicle volume because, you end up with broad shutdowns. How am I making sure the rest of my business is carrying the load a little bit more? So focusing in on the fixed op piece and making sure, that's running as smoothly as possible. And then making sure if there is some disruptions, do I have enough parts on hand to kind of manage that part of my business as well for a given amount of time?
Great advice, Erik. You're always so inspiring and always so informed. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And again, thanks to BMO for allowing us to speak to you.